It usually began the same way every evening, without alarms, without reminders, without a screen lighting up to tell you what time it was. Because time back then wasn't managed by devices. It was felt in the body. And as the sun slowly dipped behind the houses and the shadows stretched across the road, you instinctively knew it was time to head back, not because someone tracked you, but because you were trusted to return. And that trust, unspoken, heavy, real, did something to your mind that no modern upbringing can replicate. Because if you grew up in the mid-1970s, your childhood unfolded in a world where guidance existed but supervision did not, where mistakes were allowed to hurt just enough to teach, and where comfort was not immediate, and as a child you didn't realize it, but your nervous system was being trained, hardened, tuned for reality, not safety illusions. And maybe that's why, even now, decades later, you feel slightly out of sync with modern life, as if people panic too fast, complain too loudly, or collapse under pressures you instinctively know are survivable, because back then, nobody rushed in to rescue your emotions. Boredom was not treated like a disease, frustration was not labeled trauma, and disappointment was not explained away. It was experienced, processed, and absorbed. And psychology tells us something uncomfortable about that era. Children who grow up without constant emotional intervention develop stronger internal coping mechanisms, and you were one of them, whether you know it or not. Because when you fell, you got up first and cried later. If at all, when you were scared, you learned to sit with that fear instead of naming it. And when you didn't understand something, you figured it out slowly, patiently, through trial and error, not instant answers. And this created a rare mental trait modern science now struggles to recreate: delayed emotional reaction, the ability to pause before breaking, to absorb stress without immediately externalizing it, which is why today people might misread you as emotionally distant, guarded, or even cold, when in truth you are emotionally regulated at a depth most people never reach. And this trait didn't come from strength quotes or self-help books, it came from long afternoons with nothing to do, scraped knees that didn't get sympathy speeches, silence that forced thought, and responsibility that arrived earlier than expected. And if you're honest, you've always known something about you was different. Not louder, not flashier, but steadier, as if your mind was built to endure long stretches of uncertainty without reassurance. And that's because the 1970s raised children in an environment where the world didn't bend to feelings, feelings adapted to the world, and that adaptation became psychological armor, invisible but powerful. And this is why even today, when life becomes chaotic, when plans collapse, when others spiral into anxiety, you instinctively go quiet, not because you don't care, but because silence is where your mind organizes itself. And this is the first rare trait you possess: internal stability under uncertainty, a trait so uncommon now that it's as often misunderstood, but it's also the foundation of leadership, resilience, and long-term success. And once you recognize that this trait was not accidental, but forged by an era that demanded mental self-reliance, you begin to see your past differently, not as outdated, not as harsh, but as the training ground that shaped you for a world that is slowly realizing how fragile it has become. And this realization is only the beginning. If you grew up in the 1970s, something unusual happened to your emotional system that most people today never experience. You learned how to exist without being constantly emotionally mirrored, and that absence didn't weaken you, it trained you. Because back then, feelings were real, but they weren't constantly discussed, labeled, or validated out loud, which meant your mind had to learn how to regulate itself internally. And modern psychology now calls this self-soothing capacity, a rare trait where a person can experience stress, disappointment, or emotional pain without immediately needing external reassurance. And this is why you may notice that when others fall apart over criticism, rejection, or uncertainty, you instinctively pull inward, not to escape, but to stabilize, because you were conditioned early on to deal with emotional discomfort privately, and this created something like invisible mental armor, not dramatic, not aggressive, but incredibly durable. And it explains why you don't panic easily, why emotional chaos drains you, and why you often feel strongest when others feel overwhelmed, because chaos feels familiar to your nervous system, not threatening. And another rare trait formed during that era is non-performative resilience, meaning you don't announce your struggles, you don't turn pain into identity, And you don't seek attention for endurance, because endurance was normal where you came from, not something to be re-war. Dead. And this deeply confuses modern culture, where resilience is often performative and vulnerability is broadcast for validation. But you were trained in silence, and silence created strength. Because when nobody rushed in to fix your feelings, you learned how to process them slowly, which is why you may struggle to explain your inner world to others. Not because you lack depth, but because your depth was never meant to be displayed. And psychology shows that people raised this way develop high emotional compression, the ability to carry complex emotional experiences without leaking them into every interaction, which makes you appear calm, steady, sometimes even intimidating. And here's the uncomfortable truth. People often trust you more than they understand you, because your presence feels grounded, predictable, and safe, even if they can't explain why. And this is also why you may feel irritated by emotional overreaction, dramatic urgency, or constant reassurance seeking, not because you lack empathy, but because your brain was wired to solve problems before expressing distress. And that wiring also gave you earned confidence, not the loud kind, not the motivational speaker kind, but the quiet certainty that comes from having survived things without guidance, without praise, without instruction manuals. And this is why compliments rarely change how you see yourself, and criticism rarely destroys you. Because your sense of self was formed internally, not negotiated externally, and once that kind of identity is built, it becomes very hard to shake. And this trait, this invisible mental armor, is becoming rare in a world addicted to emotional outsourcing, because when people grow up with constant validation, they never learn how to hold themselves together when validation disappears. But you did, long before you had language for it. And that's why even now, when life applies pressure, you don't crack loudly, you compress, you adapt, you endure. And while others may call this emotional distance, psychology calls it advanced emotional regulation, and it is one of the most powerful survival traits a human can possess in an unstable world. If you grew up in the 1970s, your mind was shaped in an environment that quietly trained one of the rarest cognitive abilities left in modern society, the ability to think without constant stimulation because your attention was not hijacked every few seconds. Your thoughts were allowed to stretch, wander, and mature. And boredom was not treated as a problem to be solved, but as a state to be endured. And neuroscience now confirms that boredom is where deep cognitive wiring forms. Because when the brain is not externally occupied, it turns inward, building imagination, pattern recognition, and long-term reasoning. And this is why you may notice that your thinking operates in layers rather than reactions, that you instinctively look for context before conclusions, cause before emotion, and meaning before noise, because your brain was trained in sustained attention cycles, something that is almost extinct today. And this is also why modern environments feel mentally exhausting to you, not because you can't keep up, but because your mind was not designed for constant interruption. It was designed for depth. And this depth manifests as delayed judgment, meaning you don't immediately label situations as good or bad. You observe, you wait, you collect information, and people often mistake this for indecision, when in reality it's advanced cognitive processing. And another rare trait forged in that era is nonlinear thinking, the ability to connect ideas across time rather than reacting only to the present moment, which explains why you often see consequences others ignore, why you think in long-term outcomes while others chase short-term relief, and why impulsive decision-making feels reckless to you, because your brain learned early that actions echo forward. And this also explains why you may have felt mentally older than your peers even when you were young, because children raised with real responsibility develop accelerated psychological maturity, not through pressure, but through exposure to reality. And that exposure created a mind that respects uncertainty rather than fearing it, which is why you can sit with unanswered questions without panic, why you don't need immediate clarity to function, and why you trust process over instant certainty. And psychology calls this cognitive tolerance for ambiguity, a trait strongly associated with wisdom, leadership, and creative problem solving. And here's something rarely said out loud. People with this trait often feel alienated in modern culture because shallow certainty is rewarded more than thoughtful hesitation. Loud opinions travel faster than careful insight, and your quiet, layered thinking doesn't compete well in attention markets, but it dominates in real life. Because when complexity arises, when systems fail, when surface-level thinking collapses, It's the deep thinkers who step forward naturally. And this is why you may prefer meaningful conversations over small talk, depth over popularity, substance over spectacle, because your mind was trained to value understanding over expression, and while the world may not always celebrate this way of thinking, it depends on it far more than it realizes, because progress doesn't come from reaction, it comes from reflection, and reflection is what your generation was trained in by accident, through silence, through boredom, through time, and this deep, cognitive wiring is one of the greatest psychological advantages you carry into an increasingly distracted world,